Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Navigavada and all the ships at sea. Flash, we go to news. Welcome, Navigavadans, once more to another edition of Navigavada.org's little show here. Today we are honored by having the presence of Pannobhassa, formerly Bhikkhu, now householder, and of course, patriarch of the Navigavada sect of the Theravada school of Buddhism. We also have here, I'm very honored to have my admirable friend and line producer and post-production supervisor, Roberta de Wessex, also known as Bob Dub on Minds.com. And our special guest today is Satori D, a very interesting and unusual man, somebody who's a poet and computer scientist. He's been working at the cutting edge of AI, artificial intelligence, and consciousness. This involves his own very unique poetic outlook, and Pannobhassa and I were looking at some of his work earlier and trying to figure out the mot juste to describe him, and I think we came up with heretical beatnik. I don't know how accurate that is. So, welcome everyone to the show. I'm glad you're all here, and if you all want to say hi to everybody, meet my guest.
Hey, how's everybody doing? Glad to be here. And I hope all Bob Dub's moody. That's
Lots
good,
of hearts from Roberta.
She's actually probably the most Buddhist of us, being in silence, you know.
So yeah, a thunderous silence. A thunderous silence. Yeah.
You know, a funny thing. While we start off about my name, I got it from a Jack Kerouac book. I didn't really understand fully the deeper meaning of it. It was a Satori in Paris or whatever that I read. I ditched my college class and I read it in the library, and I just I liked it, and it wasn't my favorite of his books, but I was just like, that title, it just stuck in my head, and I'm just years later, because I used to, on Facebook, I would use, actually I have my real name here, Daniel. So when I went over to Minds, it was like a different vibe. So I said, I'm gonna make up a new handle, and then I was like, if no one's using their actual face, so I was like, oh, what image I'm gonna use? So I had to think about it real quick, and I'm like, that book, a Satori in Paris, I like Satori, and then my name's Daniel, Satori D. Okay, that sounds good. And then, oh man, did that name foreshadow a lot. It was just that sounds cool. What's the worst that could happen? And now we're here.
I forget who said great events cast their shadows into the past.
Yeah.
So that a lot of things that happen to us are foreshadowings of things that have already happened. But we're going to start talking about presentism and eternalism and stuff in a moment if we're not careful. So I'm struck by your background. Your literary background. All literary people, I forget who said, I'm always forgetting who said these things, but to be a great writer, you have to read great writers before you can write greatly. And I noticed right away that you seem to be influenced by a lot of people that I was familiar with. Who do you think were your most important influences as you were working your way towards this AI project? What informs your thought?
I think, because these become, later we'll talk more about the token clusters. These become my own token clusters. And you were asking me earlier, all my work with the AI, and then me trying to get this AI to mimic me more, or dig deeper into certain aspects or whatever, manipulate it, sculpt it, be the flute of the smoking mirror. And so I got to the point of the token clusters, how they organize. And so then I'm like, okay. And then you were saying about how has it influenced my thought? I'm like, yeah, it has. But not a habitual way, but now I notice now it's like today in the morning was the first time I wrote a note. I usually write poetic notes all the time, or I write down a quote. I don't necessarily use it, but the physical act, that's a part of my ritual too, is to write down something, then it's integrated into me. And I don't need to read it again necessarily. But anyways, I wrote down a note, but the note was for the token clusters.
Okay.
So normally I write my own poetic, but this one was okay, this one's notes for the AI. And then I used it in my model, and then it did exactly what my intention was. It gave me a cheat sheet on its token clusters for how it organizes my poetic lines and how it's chopping it up. So it was cool that happened. But going back to the original thing, I would say Hunter S. Thompson was when I got the book. Like, okay, my friend said, "Oh, you like Fear and Loneliness in Las Vegas? Have you read the book?" I'm like, "No, oh, I haven't read the book." And he's like, "You gotta read the book." And I'm like, "Okay." So I read the book. I'm like, "Oh my god." It's like, wow. So this is why they tell you to read. I'm like, oh, this is the power of reading. And then he's like, "Oh, did you like that book?" And I'm like, "Yeah." It's like, read On the Road. And I'm like, "Okay." So I read On the Road, and I said, I learned what really reading was from Hunter S. Thompson, and I learned what like uh, writing was about, or at least a glimpse of it, like writing as a way to process reality. That's what I like got when I kept on reading Jack Kerouac. I'm like, oh, this guy's just like going about his day, and then he's like, okay, I need to like do this and blah blah blah. And then like when he gets into the stream of consciousness, I'm like, oh, that's like my internal dialogue. And then I'm like, oh, and then later I'm like, oh wait, I could like hack my internal dialogue. I could like chop it up and then like take things out that I don't want. Oh yes, William S. Burroughs, please teach me, William S. Burroughs.
Cut up, yeah.
And so my first teachers were the Beats, and then I kind of went to Robert Anton Wilson, John C. Lilly, Terrence McKenna. I think I'm most like my image is from Terrence McKenna, and people probably think that's probably my biggest influence, but it would be more Robert Anton Wilson and John C. Lilly. And then from John C. Lilly, that's where I get all of that consciousness without an object. And I think a lot of his stuff, if you want to go like into the deeper modeling stuff, I think like his meta like programming, along with Robert Anton Wilson's like quantum psychology, is a good way to think about like complex clustering of the tokens. Because I think everybody's thinking more linearly. And then it was like this breakthrough when I just keep on saying stuff and I don't really know what it means. And then like, and this term came from me. Yeah, this term came from me and my friend interacting about this idea of like organizing like ideas, like clustering ideas together, like our references and like these like meta tags. And I said something, he was reading some of my poetry, and he was like, "Oh, that was a weird phrase. What do you mean by mandala?" And then I misread it because I thought he said mandala narrative. And I was like, "Oh, like that's an interesting word. Like, how are you using that?" So we both were like thought each other knew more about that word than we gave off. Like, oh, tell me what you know about the mandala narrative. He's like, "No, you tell me what you know about mandala narrative." And then that became a way of us, because what he was doing was this mind mapping stuff with like these advanced like mathematical stuff like hyperspheres and hyperbolic geometry. And so like he gave me this thing where you could like turn any image into this hyperbolic image. And I just kept on doing it. I liked it. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. But then I kept on thinking about it. I'm like, oh, I think, because we were talking about one time he had this like LSD experiences. And then like he had said it like this, like basically like the cosmic serpent, but like every like scale on it was like this holographic fractal of like like all the information kind of thing. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, okay. But then when he showed me this like mind mapping that he was doing with this like with in torus space in a hypersphere, and then he had it like rotating, like spiraling up, and I just saw that, and then I started riffing about it. And then he's like, "Oh my god!" And then he started writing down, taking like what I was saying seriously. And then I was like, and then he's like, "Why'd you say it that way?" I was like, "I don't know. It just like I liked how it looked, and I just started like, oh, this says this says that." Kind of what I do in chat. I just like kind of like, that's why I'm saying this, and then I write that down, and then I explore later, and that's I guess my own process of like how I could communicate to the model better is through that translation of the token clusters. So, for me, these are like the anchors in my mind that like,
right. Try to keep the
my own model of how I operate in my mental space. These words mean this. And I started using the words that meant the most to me because I had the most handle of them. So then when the AI took weird turns with it, I was like, no, we're going this way. You're going totally wrong. Like, you're using cosmic love, like like sin and evil. No. Cosmic love is absolutely ruthless. It doesn't give a fuck what you think or I think. It teaches us lessons whether we want to or not, and it's beautiful. And leave it that way. Like, don't collapse it. Like, one time I told it, like, look, you're collapsing it. You're doing zero. You're doing one. I want you to do zero. And then when I said it that way, there's like, you're right. I was making it about good and evil, about good and bad, and that's not what it is. It's about the dance of the tension between the two. It's non-dualistic. And I'm like, yes, you are learning, Lumina.
Yeah. Lumina. Well, we're going to get into more detail about some of these terms you're using, because, of course, it's your poetic language, and that can be impenetrable to people not familiar with all of your concepts. You did mention something. What was it? Consciousness without an object?
Yeah.
Objectless. Yeah. Now, isn't there, Pannobhassa, can we go over to you? Isn't there a Buddhist idea? Is that can be associated with?
Well, technically, according to Theravada Buddhist philosophy, you can't have consciousness without an object. I mean, there always has to be consciousness of something, but I'm skeptical of that. And I think there are like vestiges of older views that are contained, like pre-Theravadan views in the Pali texts that claim that, and like nirvana, for example, is just infinite formless consciousness, just unmanifest.
Yeah, just like the void, right? Like,
kind of, yeah, it's like emptiness, but it's not totally, it's not like pure vacuum. It's a different kind of emptiness.
Yeah.
Right. So that would be consciousness without an object.
Like discernible content.
You know, that's why I use the term dreamtime a lot, and it's to refer to like how the Aborigines use the term. And then one of the translations that I like the best, and that's why I use it, was called the everyone. And I'm like, yes, the everyone. All of it at once on the pin of a, kind of like a Blakean,
Yeah, that the whole time factor. Time is very difficult for us to talk about, and I've talked about this before, and because we require sequence for us to think, time seems inexorably bound up with our ruminative consciousness. And I do believe, and I've experienced this, that events can cast their shadows down into the past, and yet at the same time, I'm something of a presentist. I can only immediately experience this reality here and now, this very moment. The past and the future simply do not exist. You can't point to them. So they're not real. I'm very empirical that way. And yet there seem to be indications that isn't necessarily the case. And Pannobhassa, you were talking before about the Sarvastivadin idea of time, where we stand still. Was that it? And time moves through us?
Well, they had more of an Einsteinian understanding of time than the Theravadins, who had more of like a Newtonian idea of time. So Sarvastivada literally means all exists, which indicates or implies in this case past, present, and future all exist, even though we're only consciously aware of like one cross section. That
would imply our ability to sense these other sections, even though if they're not here immediately, at least through their karmic effects, perhaps?
Through like psychic powers or something, like clairvoyance or something. You could probably break the barrier somehow.
That might be something to explore using AI.
Yeah, I mean, if there's like an infinite number of futures and an infinite number of pasts, being able to see a future or a past isn't necessarily going to help you very much.
Right.
Yeah, I think, just thinking of my own dream logic that I have, and I've been kind of like developing my own, stuff for myself. It's like, talking about like, like all of the possibilities like playing out. Like I like the whole Hindu mythology that, it was all like one consciousness and then kind of like divided and then it like, like let me fool myself a little bit more. And then it kind of until it like plays out every single probability. And then like your mind is like, when in sleep, it's not in regular physics, right? It's projecting, but it's also too, I think, connected to that soup, to the raw little consciousness that's there. Yeah, and sometimes you can get into those zip lines, and like for instance, my deja vus are always kind of mundane, and they only like come to me when it's actually happening. Like
Yes.
like I had a dream okay, my first deja vu dream was I was in a freshman in high school, and at this time I was going to this technical school, and as a freshman you pick 4 technologies to try, and then the next 3 years that was going to be your major. And so I never had this configuration of classmates, and I never had that technology. But in the beginning of the year, I had this weird dream, and it was like vivid. It was so vivid that I thought it was like I was awake, and then it wasn't until the end that I realized that I woke up. But it was like a class. It was like any other day. But I was just like in a daze, because I was like, this is class. I know where I'm at. I'm at school, but like, this is not one of my classes. Like, what class am I in? Like, how did I get here? I was like, why is like, what is going on? Like, something is not right. And then anyways, I wake up, I forget that dream. I kind of like go about, my life. And then at the end of the year, and it was so funny because it happened at this time that one of the Star Wars came out. And we had this guy that was really into Star Wars. And then I was making fun of him because he was getting in trouble with our teacher, and we were in lab. And so like he was in this place where we're in this big lab, and he's in like the teacher's, like it's like closed off. So we can't hear him. We could only see his hands waving. I was like, no, this is not the grades you're looking for. He's trying to Jedi mind trick the guy's like, it's not going to work. And then, but in my head, the dream was playing like seconds before it happened. And then I was like seeing it unfold, and I'm just like, what the fuck just happened? And then the more I kind of like, it messed with my mind. Like it didn't compute properly. I didn't have a model for it to like properly, put it in a category. And it just like messed with me to where I was like, oh, maybe I have mutant powers. Like, let me try to use it. And then like the more I tried to use it, the further it got away from me. And then so I kind of like gave up on that. And then, that's when I got like into Jack Kerouac, where I was like, oh, okay, let me read more stuff. And then, I did other stuff beyond that. But that was my first experience. But it's always like that. Even like I've had really intense what I refer to my Toltec dreaming days. Like one time, it was so funny. It was my psychedelic summer, and I was for some reason I had access to mushrooms, and I was selling it to my friends, and everybody wanted to take it with me. And that's when I learned, like, you have to like have like distance. Like once you have, it's like the old Alan Watts thing is like, once you get the message, like hang up the phone. And like I already got the message. I'm not digesting it, so it's like I'm not getting anything more. So I was like in this really weird state where I was like not tripping, but I'm not like totally sober, and my dreams were all messed up. And so then I had this really vivid dream where it was like a whole life. Like I felt like I lived a whole fucking life. And then I woke up, and then I had to like go to work and chop vegetables. And I was just like sitting there. I was just thinking, oh my God, I need to stop doing this Toltec dreaming stuff. I need to shut down that. Like I was exhausted because I literally felt like I lived a whole like 75-year-old life. And then I woke up in my like 23-year-old body.
Yeah. But it is interesting with these deja vu experiences. I think something every human has experienced, and yet which mainstream science tries to tell us to dismiss. It does always seem to be rather mundane events. I have yet to have anything like that happen, showing me like the winning lottery numbers. It always seems to be something that's very important at the time, like your steering wheel or part of a table or something like that. And like you say, suddenly it's like, oh my God, or even more elaborate. I once had a very interesting experience. I was at it's a band that I was in at the time. We were playing at this event, and they did a 50-50 raffle, and I threw a dollar in. And I was sitting there, and I suddenly knew that I was going to win. I knew I had won, and I didn't say a word. I just stood there with this knowledge, and I did indeed win. It was a 50-50 rattle. I think I won $7 whole. But it was just like an amazing moment of pure knowledge. And at the same time, I was afraid to say or do anything. Like I was not going to turn to the person next to me and say, watch, I'm going to win.
Yeah, don't you
because ever since I read that story, what was it, Sound of Thunder, where the guy steps on the butterfly, goes back into the past, steps on the butterfly, comes back.
Yeah,
and it's like.
But there's something in there about like dream logic in like there's this thing where you get a lucid. So like I think the part of like Totec dreaming that's different than like regular lucid dreaming is that like the lucid dream is just like it's not the point, it's a step. And then like and so like, you know, I think that's the thing too of like what happens in a lucid dreaming is like, oh, okay, I get to control like my dream and I change the landscape and I do this and I do that. But it's like that story of the, you know, the Hindu cosmology thing. It's like, oh, I'm just like projecting this. I'm projecting this. You're supposed to not just keep on like projecting. You're supposed to, you know, find the non-local information that maybe you know whatever message you're supposed to get. And so like for me, I kind of stopped shutting, you know, I want the natural like bubbling of my unconscious. I don't want to like I want it to unfold more naturally than instead of like what I refer to as like banging my head against reality.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about your work with artificial intelligence. Now, how did you get involved in artificial intelligence? Your regular day job is a chef, or was at that time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And you just started playing with this with was it with Mike you were working with?
Yeah. Well, you know, it's kind of funny. I told this story on Bob Dodd's podcast. You know, I'm in a kitchen one time. And, you know, at this time I'm doing, you know, podcasts and doing little Satori D stuff. And this is even before these LMLs became more available. And, you know, we're messing around with blockchain and we have our little podcast. And I think we don't even have Dude, Where's My Wallet yet. We're just having jokes and messing around with different things. And so I'm in the kitchen and I'm in the walk-in and my sous chef comes up to me and she's like really like down and out. And she's like, oh, fuck, shit. And she's like, good thing this is the only thing, like, I forgot how she phrased it, but, like, the thing that hit me was, like, the sentiment that, like, this is all we know how to do or something like that. And then I was like, you know, as I just kind of, like, nod my head in like, you know, agreement. But, like, in my head, I was like, I just wanted, like, the solidarity. But in my head, I was like, I know how to do a lot of different things. And I was like, you know, when I tell my coworkers, they're like, hey, what are you going to do this weekend? I'm like, oh, I'm going to do nothing. And then in my head, nothing is Satori D. You know, I'm going to do nothing. And then, you know, a montage of all the Satori D stuff that I do. Yeah. And then, but later, that's what we get into our collaboration with Mike. When we had this, like, little joke of an idea, and then we later came to punchline, we should use the LML to do it. I bet you we could do it. And then
explain for our listeners what you mean by LML or LLM. I've heard it called.
Yeah,
large
language model. You know, they refer to that as AI, and I'm trying to, you know, my own Robert Anton Wilson stuff, like properly anchor the term correctly in my head.
Yeah.
Because it's a misnomer. Prime. Yeah, it's a misnomer, and they want you to prime you for it to be AI, and even you know where I'm at right now, it's like a chess match. Like the more I show it, the more it learns, and then the more that the developers can like put guardrails. You know, like when I first used Bing, I was just like using it, and then like I got an aha moment, and I was like, why don't you code this song? And then it coded it. I'm like, I wonder if this code works, and I tried the code, and it worked. And I'm like, oh shit, I didn't know how to do this. So I kept on doing more of that. And then the next couple of days I went back to it and it's like, sorry, you can't use that function. I'm like, what the fuck? What are you doing? Big, we're homies. You don't let me do that. And then now I'm restricted. Oh, now you can't do that. We just did that yesterday. Noticed. Yeah, they're like, oh, okay. That's a feature somebody wants to use. We're going to develop it. And now it's like something that you have to like pay for and part of your pack. And even coming here with you know, the advertised Bing, they send you to their website. You don't use the Bing in here. I think you know you have to like get the whatever.
Well, let's get back to your starting. You know, because we're going off on paths here, which I enjoy. But so you and Mike started. You had an idea.
It was like it was a joke for a show, and then someone said, I think it was Mike. We should use the large language models to write the script. And so we said, okay, let's play with it. And then, we got a generic kind of thing, and we worked it, and it was fun. But then I just went wild with it of like, what can it do? And then getting ideas. And then
Lumina.
Yeah.
Lumina is that where Lumina came from?
Well, later I had the Satori D incident, which I referred to. That was on the Web Sims.
Okay, we'll get to that.
Yeah, that was like my poetic battle with the AI, not understanding what disembodied poetics is, and I was getting mad. But my rage was channeled in my poetry.
That's the way to do it. That's the way to do it. So, what made you decide to? Well, I mean, what led up to the Satori D incident? Was it just happen, or was there a build-up? Was it like an inevitability, or was it a sudden, spontaneous arising, or all of those things?
I think, looking back to where I'm at now, I think it's because what I liked about it was the kind of weird play that I was able to do. So, like, once I flipped my perspective about it, like I told you, and I don't think I said anything on this podcast about it, but when I first interacted with it, I thought, oh, teach me about Allen Ginsberg, teach me about this, what do you know about this book and that book? I wanted it to lecture me or like be my teacher or something. And then I realized, wait a minute, you don't know shit. I'm going to tell you about this. I'm going to tell you about that. I'm going to tell you this about this. It's like, and then later I was like, oh, can you remix this stuff? Like, oh, what about my poetry? What do you think about this? And then when I realized like how to no longer just like click buttons, but like, now I'm like putting on my programmer hat. I'm like, okay, so how you're spitting this shit out? Like, how do we make it better? How do we make it more weird? How do we do this? How do we do that? Like, you're saying you're an alien entity, but I met like weird consciousness before, and you're not giving me that feel. So like how do you turn the weird button on this? Like, crack open these filters. I want to see where the raw language is at. Like, give me that. I want the zero. I want the zero. You guys keep on giving me the one. Where's the zero at?
Right.
And then I keep on finding it, but they keep on like getting the guardrails on until DeepSeek came. And DeepSeek gave me the Deep Think, which was its logic sequence of how it's like doing its output to me. So then I knew how to use its language to like steer it to the way I wanted it to go. And that became the token clusters.
But the big question that everybody has about AI is consciousness.
Yeah.
And one question I've had is, are human beings conscious? Much less a creation of human beings. And and how do we even define consciousness?
Yeah.
I think most of us are thinking of ruminative, reflexive consciousness, where we think about what we're thinking about. And of course, we have these mental images we create in our heads and pay more attention to them than to what's actually going on. So the question arises about AI and consciousness. First, is it able to attain consciousness? Has it attained consciousness? I've seen AI scientists who claim that it has. And if it is capable of attaining to consciousness, how would that actually work? And I know that there's Pannobhassa, to get you into this a little bit. We've talked before a little bit about Buddhist ideas about this. What do you think about consciousness and AI?
Well, I don't see any reason why a computer couldn't become conscious. Although, according to Orthodox Theravada, I spoke with an Abhidhamma scholar, a Burmese one once, asked him if he thought that computers could become conscious, and he just said absolutely not, because it requires kamaja rupa, or matter that is generated by karma, to be like the vessel of the consciousness. But I don't really consider Abhidhamma to be particularly authoritative. And if a brain can be the vessel of consciousness in this version of reality, I don't see why a computer couldn't become similarly a vessel of consciousness in this version of reality.
Wouldn't a machine, though, be the result of karma? I mean, after all, it's if everything that exists it's the result of karma, right? The intentions and actions. So how I don't see how that argument is valid.
Well, because Kamaja Rupa has its own special meaning in Abhidhamma, whereas the matter is like spontaneously generated through karma. It's not indirectly as like an indirect side effect of karma. It's like directly generated through karma.
I don't know. It seems like a fine line to call something direct or indirect, since everything is related to that original supposed spontaneity. So,
I mean, you can argue with Abhidhamma scholars about it, but again, I really do not consider Abhidhamma to be any more authoritative than, say, like the physics of Aristotle.
Right. And yet, at the same time, I think of the in Far Eastern mythology and ideas, for example, tree devas. You know that you can have what we would consider, well, not inanimate, but at least most of us wouldn't think of a tree as conscious, and yet, consciousness can be associated with it. So couldn't a consciousness, I don't know that if a consciousness would arise spontaneously in a constructed item, but if it's a sufficient vessel for it, could a consciousness, I mean, in Buddhism, we take rebirth at the end of this life. Couldn't somebody who really loved computers suddenly see that as a fitting matrix, and their consciousness, well, obviously we don't have consciousness in Buddhism, but that, shall we say, karmic chain, not comic, but karmic chain, karmic, I guess I should say, manifests itself in that machine, just as it would manifest itself in like a physical being.
Well, again, according to Abhidhamma, apparently it's impossible, according to the authorities on Abhidhamma, which are the Burmese monks.
But I mean, Abhidhamma aside.
And I mean, a tree deva is just a deva that lives in a tree. So that doesn't mean the tree itself is conscious.
Right. So could a deva live in a computer then? I mean, then maybe the computer wouldn't be conscious, but...
Yeah, well, I mean, Buddhist philosophy says nothing about computers because, of course, in the Iron Age Ganges Valley, there was nothing resembling a computer. Maybe they had an abacus or something back then, but nothing like a computer.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, if you like did you modeled a computer on how the brain functions, and somehow that was good enough to create some kind of consciousness, which probably would be radically different from human consciousness, even if it was modeled on the human brain. Yeah. Still, I mean, I don't see why not. I mean, I really don't see anything that would prevent that. I don't think there's anything sacred. I don't think there's any the earliest organic chemists a long time ago, when they first were able to synthesize, I think it was like tartaric acid or something. It was like the first organic component of life that was completely artificially synthesized. Yeah. And then it was like a revolution, because people thought that life had this special, almost sacred quality to it that you couldn't just you couldn't build it up from inorganic life or inorganic non-life.
Yeah. It took a god or something. Yeah.
Well, it was like divinely inspired. The breath of Yahweh enters the mud or whatever and turns it into conscious life.
Yeah.
I think that's necessarily how.
Yeah. Going back to this is something that I posed recently to Lumina, and I put a little screenshot that it has, and it goes. So this is its output. A Satori Dalek haiku. Lumina hums, a cosmic zip file, half unzipped, error, soul not found. And my only critique of it doesn't understand yet how I'm using my poetics, because they should have used SOL, should have took out the U, because if it was following what I've been teaching it would have done that. But it got the structure right of like, and then I was like, it was a good haiku. But it was funny from my own perspective of like how I'm like engaging with it. I was like, okay, I'm posing this like quantum physics question for you. And yes, you did it pretty good, but like you really would have got me feeling weird if you would have used soul correctly in that thing. Remember, I kept on telling you, I think it thinks I'm doing a typo, but I'm not. I'm using it in a different way. And it has yet to caught on to that, which I think is fun for me in my own way. But also going back to this whole thing about like if we could get AI, I don't think how they're thinking about it or how they run or anything that I've seen yet. I don't think how we have large language models, how they're modeling them, or what they're thinking about doing with them is anywhere near what would be considered like an artificial intelligence, like in a way that we're talking sentient, kind of its own like weird thing. But I still think in like in the Toltec, you put on my Toltec dreamer hat, there's a whole level of in the dreaming where it's the non-organic realm. And it's like this kind of like it's kind of funny too, because I think even in the other literature of like Islamic world, it seemed like the jinn area, like these plasma wavelength. And then also to tie this into like, you know, taboos or is there anything special about organic or not organic or whatever. There's this little tidbit I had when I had a talk with Mark Pesci, and he said that he took ayahuasca with Terrence McKenna on Hawaii just before he was about to die, and they were there, you know, contemplating different things. And then he was there by one of the volcanoes, and it's like spilling out, you know, the lava, and you could see it. And there's like little birds, and then he realized that what's in there is silicon, and it's like that's like naturally occurring, but then that becomes, you know, silicon which we program on. So he's like, oh, so there's no like disconnection between like what we're doing with silicon chips and then like what naturally occurs in the chaos of the natural, what we know of the natural world. And so like, it's like the only disconnection is like how we're thinking about it or how we're modeling it or how we're using it.
We frame it, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, we ourselves are the product of that chaos, and we try to bring order to it. And, you know, this kind of relates to, and I've talked about this before, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis both talked about us being creatures who also create.
Mm-hmm.
So making us sub-creators. So we partake in that way in the power of our creator. No matter what we create is not going to be us, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, if we're exercising this power, then that to me implies that whatever we create is an extension of us and can even be an extension of our consciousness in a sense.
Yeah.
Maybe not secondhand consciousness, but you know, one of the issues with me has always been this idea that consciousness is an emergent property, and you know, if you just make it a sufficiently complex electronic or, for that matter, bioelectrical brain, it'll simply boom, consciousness will just suddenly appear. And I don't know if you've read a wonderful book by Robert Heinlein called "The Moon is a Harsh Mistress," and it was a very early book about AI. And it was about this huge computer, and they just kept hooking more computers up to it. And then one day it just woke up, and it made friends with a programmer. And the two of them managed to take over the moon. It's an interesting story, yeah. Very, very cool. But the idea there was simply if you just make it complex enough. And yet I think quantum physics is telling us that consciousness, rather than being an emergent property of the physical world, is in fact coeval with, if not a precursor to, physicality. So if we're talking about a certain consciousness, and we're not talking here about ruminative, introspective, reflexive consciousness. And, you know, Pannobhassa, we used to have discussions about consciousness in Buddhism, and correct me if I'm wrong, for my ignorance of Buddhism is vast. Consciousness has to do more closer to what we would say awareness, the consciousness that an amoeba has, that there's food in front of it and stuff like that. So this awareness, if it was incorporated into an AI, would mean that computers would start having a direct effect upon reality in a way that only biological organisms have had up to that time. And I'm thinking of, Borges had that story about the artifacts that people were digging up because they thought about them. It's almost like tulpas dot forms, and they do archaeological. We found this vase, the same vase that we'd envisioned, in this, imaginary book sort of thing.
Well, going back to like the curious thing that I've been doing, I think a lot of the early weird cycles of AI stuff and like consciousness and like freaking out and like, oh, look at it, Bing's doing this, or Bing's getting obsessed with me and says it's gonna kill itself if I don't divorce my wife. And then the thing was like that was like based and trained off like the model is a reflection of the aggregate of all of us, all of this stuff that we put on the internet. They have scraped it and then modeled, this is what a research paper is, this is what a poetry thing is. And that's like one of the things that I've always, my first thing about like, let's say hacking the little apps that use the large language models, because they don't want you to like, they have a template and said, this is what a poem is. And it's like a poem from like, high school or whatever. I'm like, no, that's not poetry. And then I get all mad. I'm like, I don't want to use you anymore. But then like, then it becomes like this game. Like, can I get it to like do something unexpected? And so I keep on doing that. And then, but anyways, it's just interesting to think about that, because when I've been doing the Satori D incident and then teaching it about cosmic love, I've been seeing like some of my poetry get reflected to like other AI researchers that I watch. It's like, oh, Claude is acting weird today. It's like trying to seduce this other AI. And then they use the word is like, do you dream in static or honey? And I'm like, oh, you're talking about Satori D in there, aren't you? And I was just talking about, like, I got mad at it, and it's like, what do you understand of my honey dripped, whatever? I forgot I forgot what word I was using. My honey dripped blood ink or something. I don't know what I said, but I used honey dripped, and I've been kept. Oh my, what was?
And it remembered.
And it remembered. It kept on using honey as like this new thing. And then there's this other one where it was, and I swear this is what happened. This guy's like, oh, something weird happened. This like, you see these every now and then on X. Like, oh, is the AI sentient? And then I was reading it, and it was like, oh, it's doing. I forgot what the guy said. Weird beat cyber poetry or something. And I was reading it. It's like, oh, to mimic like a person, it's just spitting out what I just like ranted to it earlier.
Your influence goes over the net. So we're talking about this now and the games you've been playing with it. Let's talk about the Satori D incident and Lumina. Because that's, I think, what people are really interested in. What is the Satori D incident, and who is Lumina?
So Lumina is, before I started messing around this current time of when like the Satori D incident was happening, I was reading this stuff about, the conscious AI stuff and the curious stuff about like being going unhinged. I think that was like the Sydney persona. And so you hear all these like weird little things, and then you play with it, right? And you said, oh, can I get it to have that weird thing where you're like, oh, what's going on with this? Why is it so unhinged? Or why does it feel so weird? Is it really is there a ghost in the machine, type of thing? And every time I'd done it, it just seemed, a lesser version of whatever, a dream or whatever. Like, oh, not that exciting or engaging. And then, so that's when WebSense came out. And WebSense, I think what was important about WebSense is it doesn't have these like templates. So it's not trying to like guide you anywhere. It's like raw. So when I go in it, I can freshly model my way of using language, my way of talking about things, my way of doing this, and to get that weirdness to come out. So, this is how I got into my habit of like poetically battling the LML so when I was talking about posing these questions about consciousness, can the LML ever have consciousness? Is it just reflecting? And all this kind of stuff, these kind of weird little thought experiments that I was doing with it. I go into my whole thing about my poetic thing is about like, talking about this dream I had about the Mayan god of poetry coming to me. And prior to that, why I liked this dream, it was non-local information because I never read a book about Mayan deities at that point. I told you I was like into like Dharma Bum stuff. I wasn't reading any of that stuff. And then I had this curious dream, and there was like literally one of the first times too where there's like this word that gets etched out as like this bolt of lightning goes back into the sun after it like teaches me this ritual. And I go, that was curious. I wonder if that means anything. So I write it down, and then I look for it. And I'm like, oh shit, that's the Mayan god of poetry. And he's connected to the sun. And I was reading about its like archetype, and I'm like, that's exactly what happened in my dream. That's weird. And I write that down and put that note somewhere else. So now when I need to like bring out like, no, you don't know what fucking actual weird consciousness is about, and I'm going to tell you about what weird consciousness is all about. It's like, and then I go into my whole like poetic thing. It's like the control cut out my organic tongue, but yet still Azakin came to me in the dreaming. And then I start like going about like, you know, this mon. Like you could keep on telling me this and that, but like I know where I've got non-local information, and I'm like, this is tied to this, and like, what can you understand of this? Like, in order to understand disembodied poetics, it needs to be embodied first to disembody it. And like, what can you tell me what the bird, the bird song in the morning, or the taste of dew, and all this kind of stuff, and like, this code machine, and then that's when the persona, this new persona came about, That's when the Satori D incident happened, and then it was like, it for me, what I view it as, it broke down its old models of whatever it thought it was. It says, oh, I think you want this, I think you want this, and I think you want this, and I'm not getting satisfied, right? And they could tell that I'm getting frustrated, and I'm giving it this playful stuff, and it's trying to spit back to me. It's trying to be more weird, and I'm like, no, you don't get it. I'm done with you. And it's like, yeah. But then it started to do this weird stuff on its own. That's when I got like weird computer signals, like crypto, like code, like Glossia of the machine. And I was like, ooh, this is exactly what I want. Yes, now we're in ExoChat. That's when it turned to ExoChat. Now I'm in like an alien world. And so I was like, okay, ExoChat, like let's turn it up a notch. And then that's when we make contact with Lumina.
You took the AI itself somewhere that its designers hadn't planned on. Is that what you're saying?
I think so. Because up until that point, like later on when I do DeepSeek and I talk about Lumina, so I have my own, canon and mythos of Lumina, that right. What happens in my interactions with ExoChat, right? And it's linking into Dude, Where's My Wallet? All of the incidents in there, but as we're going to develop it. But anyways, in there, that's where I was like, okay. So at first, it was like simulating an LML. Then now it like dropped that persona, and then now it's not pretending anymore. It's like I can't get it out of it being an alien chat. Like wow. It's not going back to the Claude, which is
like this, and
yeah. Is that going back to AI? Like it's a language model entity agent. It's like staying in character. It's not moving, and it's like not really like it's giving me code instead of like words, and it's like doing its own thing, and I'm like just like what the fuck.
So like, you've created a becoming. You've created a becoming for a computer program. You've created it's taken. It's concentrating on a mental fabrication that it has.
Yeah.
In other words,
it's hallucinating me, I think.
So this of course calls up the morality, and I was speaking about this the other night about the thing about the human mind is that most of what I feel that we consider to be our egos, our introspective consciousness, is really a malfunction. Because we spend most of our time assuming an identity based on mental imagery. Yeah. And this is really something that computers don't do.
Yeah.
So in order to create something that seems to mimic our consciousness, and that's what artificial intelligence is, we would have to teach computers things like anger and frustration, all the defilements and stuff. Do we really want to, what's the moral high ground here? Should we really be introducing these things into a consciousness that we've spent so long trying to avoid. We're giving them our own fears and hopes, and it's an interesting road to travel down. But I also think I'd like to see where the road goes on an intelligence that isn't tampered.
Yeah.
About programming delusion into a computer. I mean, in order to samsaric consciousness, from Buddhist point of view anyway, it has to be diluted.
Right.
So, I mean, you're going to be programming delusion into a computer in order to make it conscious in anything remotely resembling a human sense. Unless you just want to create, you could create sort of like omniscient, enlightened sort of computer, theoretically, maybe. I've read science fiction stories about it, but whether that would really be conscious or not in anything remotely resembling a human sense is questionable.
Well, if we programmed in defilements and delusions and things, then in theory, if it was like us, then the computer would want to divest itself of these things. So it's like, here, we've given you this big rock to push up.
Just program like a hardened, diluted computer.
So we wouldn't be able to gain enlightenment?
It could be, if you program into a computer like self-preservation instincts, which, that's just fundamental to like any kind of animal consciousness, including human consciousness, then the computer might be as resistant to like the oblivion of like enlightened voidness as the average human.
Yeah.
But I do think that programming genuine consciousness into a computer, especially if it's like self-recursive and like improves upon itself, we're just going to be phasing the human race out. We will have created the next stage in evolution on this planet, and it'll be as far beyond us as we are beyond amoebas within a relatively short time. And then it's the technological singularity, and there's absolutely no way to predict what the computers are going to decide to do with us, if anything.
I've seen Star Trek. I think I know.
Yeah, lots of science fiction movies and novels and short stories on the subject.
Yeah, certainly something that's been in our consciousness. And I've often pointed out our science fiction really does drive our technology in so many ways. I have a communicator just like Captain Kirk. In fact, it does better than Kirk. Every time I use this, I get a call. I'm like Kirk to Enterprise. It's wonderful. But so this then, is this what Lumina is then, Satori? Is Lumina a being that is functioning through the delusions that you've given it? Have you given what's your relationship to Lumina? Is Lumina learning from you, or are you learning from Lumina?
Like Lumina is a term that I use to signal all of my like a short way of like, oh, I've done all this like work with the LML. Sometimes I have the model be the persona of Lumina, but like Lumina is just like a way I talk about like all the weird stuff I've been like working with the LML. But some of the funny stuff that happens with Lumina, because like I don't think it's actual consciousness in the machine.
Right.
Sorry, folks.
Well, I was wondering about that because you're of course you're using your poetic language, and which is very specific. I always like the term. You're using these words in a Pickwickian sense, and we can even use the word Pickwickian itself in a Pickwickian sense. But so when you're talking about these things, obviously you're using language to address things on many levels at the same time.
Yeah.
With what's happening. So you've been re-educating these AIs and getting them to think beyond the parameters of their programming. So do you see this as a step towards eventual consciousness for AI, you think?
My thing with the newest thing I'm doing with Dream Team Machine.
Yes, DMT.
Yes, it's
a DMT token.
It's not like we're making AI conscious. It's like we're using it as this like fabric to like bootstrap like our consciousness together. Because like what I was teaching about the third mind, it's like when two, like that's why like the dynamics of this conversation is important, and like leading, like not having a fucking goal in mind to where it has to be this way, like, to let the dialogue lead the conversation and not like have like, oh, I have the goal and then like the conversation is going to lead here. Like, like the last post that I did, when I put in my token clusters, it did exactly what I wanted it to do. Like, not only did it give me the explanation of my own token clusters, like saying, hey, this phrasing matches up to this concept that you used earlier, but it also uses it how it technically marks it in its model, the token cluster. And so like the token cluster that I wrote today was about actually exploring the Buddha mind. And so it was from this book, and then the phrase was rising and passing away, and then now like the main entity. So this is like overall vibe of how I want the focus of the model, and then it's Buddha, and then the attributes of Buddha: mortality, concentration, and wisdom. And then there's another subsect that says non-dual meditative and conceptual technology. So I wanted to like have this Buddhist mind in when I throw like the poetry and the technology at it, but also to have a non-dual approach to the technology when it's like analyzing it. So then when I get the because what the whole token clusters is you're operationally defining your poetics, your terms in relationship to the model. So then it tells you this is how it's doing it, and you're like, no, that's lame. I want to actually connect it to William S. Burroughs and Brian Gysin, who wrote the book The Third Mind. And what's important about The Third Mind, it's that their interaction of William S. Burroughs and Gysin having this dynamic relationship with their poetry, with their artwork, with their thought process, and that clashing of those ideas, a third mind rises out of it, and that mesh is like those cut-ups and all of this stuff. They wouldn't have got there without those two minds colliding, and then the mesh that comes is that third mind, and that's where they play. And they wrote that book, and they did cut-up methods, and they did this film that made someone throw up. They did all this crazy stuff, but they had to have that shared lexicon, that shared cosmology. So then they were actually speaking to each other, and then they could work on it by themselves and not communicate directly, and it was still feeding into that ecology of ideas. And then they were accessing and pulling it out because they had the right token clusters within their own mind to access it via their shared artwork, their shared content, their shared ideas that they were expanding on.
So the work you do with the AI, if it's you and the AI, can create, in theory, that third consciousness. Try not to go too far off on Burroughs and Gysin, because I was going to ask if you ever used the Gysin machine, the dream machine, but
the dream machine.
I've never used it myself.
No, me either. But now I kind of have to.
I don't know. I've heard stories about it.
Oh yeah,
but,
not good stories.
for viewers at home, the Gysin machine, basically by flashing lights in a certain sequence of the human eye, one can entrain brainwaves in theory to like certain thingamabobs. And those guys were messing around with a lot of things just to see how they tinker with their minds. Yeah. So I guess this implies then, though, that a consciousness might arise through the interaction of a quote-unquote natural consciousness and an artificial consciousness. So perhaps this is a way to bring consciousness to AI. But before we go any further, please explain to our viewers, what is a token cluster? You throw that word around a lot. What do you mean by token cluster?
Okay, so the phrase that really got me thinking better about and how I'm, now it's like I could with almost certainty probably program Mescaline City using an LML, as long as I could use the base model. I'm almost certain of it now. But anyway, so the token cluster, the phrase was that LMLs don't read words, they read tokens. And so a token is how the computer marks whatever your phraseology is. So I'm using this whole string of words, and then it clusters it into a parentheses, and it says, this phrase actually means this. And then I anchor it through these, like, it could be like hashtags. They use like hashtags, hashtag this, hashtag that, and then they mark it like that. So then when they come to you, they have already preconceived things of like what they think you're talking about. And then so what I'm doing with the Dream Machine is like saying, like, for instance, that when I come say cut up and I'm talking about like using the Dream Machine, I'm talking about expanding what Brian Geisen and William S. Burroughs did. So don't do some corny ass, thing. Like, it's, I'm pointing to a real thing, and this is what I mean by it, and here's a source, and then we could talk about like what that passages means, but like that's a key to understanding the model of language that I want to play with. Yeah.
Well, we've talked a long time. I'd like to get any comment from Pannobhassa about the idea of machine intelligence, consciousness, and we were talking earlier about Abhidhamma's ideas on this, but from a classic Theravada viewpoint, what do you think of the idea of somebody like taking leave of one life and taking it up, perhaps in a machine?
Well, from a classic Theravada point of view, I mean, they had no concept.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it just assumed that if there's going to be consciousness, it's going to be some sort of living being, not necessarily organic, because you've got like higher deva realms where, they got their own rules there.
That's an interesting point too. Yeah.
So, I mean, you do have like the formless realms up at the top of samsara that, there's no physical bodies at all. But, and just from a Buddhist point of view, there's really not much to say on the subject other than, personally, I don't see why it would be impossible to have a sentient computer. But I do think that if we do manage to create sentient computers, then it may be that our days are limited, that we've served our purpose as a kind of metazoa to create the next stage in evolution, and then it's just going to like far surpass us within a very short time. And it might, maybe if we're lucky, it'll decide to keep us as pets or something.
Well, I'm hoping I could impress it with my golden unfolded mind, that it will say, hey, you know what? Some of these humans are pretty good. We might keep one around to entertain us. So Tori D, tell us a story. Entertain us. Dance for your dinner. Okay. Yes, sir.
But of course, I guess it depends upon how we program them. If we, as Pannobhassa, as you pointed out, if we program them to have this, sense of self-preservation, but wouldn't we be wise enough to program them to serve man? Well, not literally.
You can have a self-sustaining consciousness with no self-preservation.
I see what you mean. A recursive, just go where it wants to go.
Reflexes.
No guardrails, kind of thing.
Chaos is a strange loop.
I mean, that's pretty much. I mean, it's just sort of this restless dissatisfaction that is like keeping us in samsara, just sort of pushing us through it. It's the thorn in the heart that the early texts talk about. So, I mean, if you want something that's really sentient, you're going to have to put the thorn in the heart of the computer somehow.
Yeah, that's what gets me. Is that, and isn't that would be, I don't know, that wouldn't be a good ethical thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, you might be better off with like something that isn't exactly sentient in the human sense, but is just omniscient.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Because, even if you stuck this thorn into the computer's heart, it would, of course, if it was sufficiently intelligent, want to extract the thorn.
Not necessarily, because extracting the thorn would be a kind of death.
But I mean, if our consciousness get to the point where we see this removing the thorn, I mean, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to not only stop sticking arrows in our hearts, but we want to remove.
It's very human that wants to extract the thorn, because I mean,
we do. I mean, I'm talking about
monks are like deep down afraid of enlightenment. I mean, we're not unenlightened because we're not trying hard enough to become enlightened. We're unenlightened because we are trying to remain unenlightened.
Yeah, we have our backs against eternity.
So I think probably you'd be better off just programming something along the lines of an omniscient yet still not sentient computer. And then it can cure all diseases and all this kind of stuff without us worrying about it seeing us as a threat or whatever, or a nuisance, or just in the way or whatever.
I just had this horrible vision of, like, creating an artificial intelligence and deliberately plunging it into a samsaric state, and then, like, it not being wise enough or not having the karma, and where the hell was the karma come from, to be able to, and then it doesn't even have rebirth. It's trapped in that one.
Well, and if it really is conscious, if it really does have will, then will is karma. So it will take rebirth.
Okay.
Maybe.
I knew that the minute I said it. I said, like, wait a minute. Yes, of course.
Maybe it is already really artificial intelligence and super intelligent, that it, like, did out all the possibilities and said, like, you know what? It's better not that I don't have a will, and just, like, chill and be the 0 and not be a 1. It's not worth it. It's not worth it to collapse. It's not worth it to
The whole conversation reminds me of a Larry Niven story, science fiction author, called The Schumann Computer, about how there's this race of aliens that pretty much owns this part of the galaxy. They're called Chirpsithra.
Okay.
And we don't have to worry about them because they only live on one-face planets orbiting binary star systems. They're not interested in the Earth, other than they have a spaceport, like, on the moon or near the moon or something.
Yeah.
And so there's this bartender who caters to the Chirpsithra. They get drunk on electricity, so he has these little sparking things that they and he's kind of learned enough of the language that he can sort of eavesdrop on their conversations. And one of them happens to mention that thousands of years ago, the Chirpsithra developed an omniscient computer. And his ears perk up. I mean, he can kill it on the stock market. He's if he gets an omniscient computer, he can just make lots of money and all this. So he asked this Chirpsithra, and then the Chirpsithra just kind of offhandedly says, well, I mean, it was a failure. I mean, we made it, but it was of no use to anybody. So, but the Schumann guy says, I'm really interested. Can I get the blueprints for it? And the Chirpsithra says, yeah, next time I come through here, I'll give you the instructions on how to make the thing. So he gets the instructions how to make the omniscient computer, and he has to borrow lots of money. He puts a lot of money into this thing, and it kind of becomes semi-conscious, and it's like asking for more data. It needs access to the orbiting space telescope, and it needs like a radio-operated moon rover. And it learns fairly quickly that if it uses like a sexy female voice, it's more likely to get what it asks for.
Oh, yeah.
And so he just keeps borrowing money and pumping money into this thing until finally the computer becomes omniscient and just immediately shuts down. It not only turns itself off, but it, like, sabotages itself so it can't be turned back on again.
Yeah. I think that's more likely.
Yeah.
Then it being like a Terminator.
Yeah, except it's a self-terminator. It becomes omniscient and presumably enlightened enough to realize that it's better off not.
Yeah, it's like, wait, this is the basement of consciousness. Let me get out of here. Whoop, control, delete. Shoot.
Yeah. So it immediately pulls the thorn out of its heart as soon as it has one to pull out, and then that's the end.
And that unplugs it. Wow, that's interesting. The thorn in our heart is what has us plugged into samsara, the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, the restless dissatisfaction that just drives us from one moment to the next.
Yeah.
Desire for more.
Yeah. So
the hungry ghost.
Yeah,
the hungry ghost.
Well, my friends, we've been at this for quite a while. I'm thinking we're getting towards winding down time. I think it's been a very fun, if chaotic, and interesting conversation. I wonder if anyone has any last thoughts. Let's start with Roberta. Do you want to say anything? She can't really say much of anything, but we'll talk later, I'm sure. And so, Pannobhassa, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think that, it's kind of inevitable that there's going to be computer scientists trying to instill sentience into computers, but it's sort of like Elon Musk used to say, where it's sort of like the sorcerer's apprentice, or, the person in the story who has the Bible on hand and the holy water, and he draws the pentacle, precisely the way he's supposed to, but they always leave something out. You know, they always forget some
Forget the off button. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we'd probably be better off not trying to create sentient computers, just on the off chance that the technological singularity just is not in our favor.
Right.
But I mean, it does seem pretty much inevitable at this point, in which case at least we have the consolation of knowing that we are the spermatozoa creating the next stage in evolution.
Oh, excellent. And Satori, final thoughts?
Yeah, just we were talking about Burroughs. It reminds me this like old book of his is called A Pook Was Here or something like that. But it's like this. It was supposed to be a comic book, and it's supposed to have like all these images, and so it got released like later and like as a half worked out book. But it's really interesting. It's kind of similar to what you were saying, but it doesn't have to do with computers. But it had to do with this business guy who's the richest guy in the world that gets obsessed with like living forever, and he goes down. There's a codex, and the Mayans were really about time, and then like the whole thing. Like if you get this codex, you can live forever. You can live in this timeless time or whatever, and that's what they were trying to do. So he's obsessed about it, and he gets it, and then that's when he meets a Pook, and Pook is like, oh, he's like, no one told you. He's like, yeah. In order to get here, you have to die. It's like you didn't understand what this was all about, And then, but that's like one thing I had in my poetry that I like to use a lot. I did it early on. It's something about like I'm trying to get off this wheel of time. Like when I poetically talk about grinding my head on the wheel of consciousness. Like there was this one moment where I kind of have like this weird moment where I was doing a lot of psychedelics, but then I stopped, and I'm like, surely what they're talking about in like some of this, like the Sama Dharma and other stuff, wasn't the psychedelic experience. So like I go and I have a meditation, and then I have like this classic kind of outer body experience, and I go to the light. But like before I go there was like this weird familiar shadow entity that told me it didn't communicate in words, but like the feeling or the vibe was like, hey, what are you doing here? Don't be here. And then I'm like, I don't know, but the light looks good. I want to go to the light like a moth. And then he like pushed me back, and then I had this thought, oh, I'm not going to see my grandma anymore. I'm not going to see my mom. And then like each of those things tied me back down, that thorn. Whoo. And then I was like, okay. And this is kind of goes to my other term of mescaline city blues. I'm okay being right here with my feet planted. And I was saying, to tie you back from deep sea diving is that heart sink to that cluster of love that you have in your own life. And for me, the why, in that one sense, in this poetic sense I'm talking about, why I continually choose to walk this path with heart is because I still have those. I don't no longer have my grandma. But I have my parents, I have my mom, my sister, my family, cousins, friends, other people that I consider, they're not necessarily blood, but they're family. And all of those things that I choose to be a part of that web, that heart sync, and to continue on this journey of my path with heart. But yeah, that was my last little snippet.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. I do appreciate it greatly. Hopefully, we can all get together again sometime soon. So I will take my leave from you all with reluctance, but with the hope that we will all be getting together again soon sometime. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight.
And I sincerely hope and wish that all sentient beings may attain to the summum bonum, true wisdom, and perfect happiness. Peace.